Jhala here because he almost choked to death during Simon's talk. And Stephanie, I noticed, almost tripped over this tripod. So just heads up on that.
Okay.
Yeah. Ranjit's going to tell us about preparing good talks.
Step 1, put on the stopwatch. Start. Okay, here we go. Oh boy, I shouldn't have done this. Anyway, here we are. So I'm going to tell you about how to give a good talk, and I should just say, I'm assuming how many people have tried to give a talk ever, like any kind of stand up in front? Okay, me too, of course, obviously. Do you feel nervous? Raise your hand if you feel nervous. I've been doing this for 20 years. I wasn't feeling nervous till like 5 minutes ago, and Phil just walked into the room. I should say before I begin that this talk is not meant if you are Simon Peyton-Jones. Because Simon Peyton-Jones could give a kick-ass talk with a brown paper bag over his head, with a blank screen. Okay, anyone who's here for his talk knows that, right? It's really for the rest of us. So I mentioned to my friend Ilya yesterday that I'm supposed to give a talk on how to give good talks, and he said, dude, are you going to be in the same session as Simon? You really asked for, So I changed my title. It's just going to be on how to prepare. Okay, so who am I? Why am I here? Why am I giving you all this advice? It turns out, I sort of looked at the calendar. I've been advising students since 2005. I really am a fogey. Here is a kind of a rogues gallery of several of the students who I've advised. Nikki she's fled. She doesn't want to get embarrassed. But anyway, several of these students are over here. I don't want to get into my advising style in great length because it's summarized in a couple of YouTube videos that you're free to look at. But one of the refrains from these is that I have a long list of students and they're going to tell you that I'm insane. I'm not singing for you. And one of the things that I'm really obsessive about is talks. Because I have very strong opinions on talks. So first of all, what I want to tell you is why is it that I obsess about talks in the first place? And why, even if you get nothing else out of this, I just want to emphasize to you that this is probably the most important skill that you will learn wherever you are. Right? If you're an undergrad, you go to grad school, doesn't matter. You should really pay attention to learning how to speak or how to prepare your talks. So this scary-looking gentleman is Howard Aiken. He's one of the kind of early sort of computer scientists. He designed the Harvard Mark I back in the 40s. And he has this famous quote, which you may have heard. Don't worry about people stealing your ideas. If they're any good, you're going to have to ram them down people's throats. Okay? And a talk is really the best way to ram ideas down people's throats. Okay? So it's the one place I have a captive audience. There's like, 50 of you, 70 of you. And you really have no option but to listen to it, right? So if I have how did Simon put it, if I have this virus that I want to infect you with, well, the talk is probably the best vector for doing so. So really, a talk is the best way in which I can get other people to think about my ideas. Maybe you have sort of cool ways to do follow-on research, other kinds of topics. It may be a new way to just build a community. I want to get new collaborators to work on the problems that I care about. It's the same thing. It goes back to Simon's virus infection theory. If I'm building a tool of some sort, I have a library, maybe I want new people to use it, it's a way to inspire that. And finally, this is one of the favorite bits of advice I got from Jens Parsberg, who's a computer scientist at UCLA. Jens said you should think of every talk as a job talk. Every talk you ever give is an opportunity for somebody to, to look at whatever you're doing and, to maybe hire you to do one thing or the other, right? So this brings us to the question of, okay, fine. Suppose you're persuaded that it's really important to give good talks. How exactly does one go about making a good talk? Okay, is there a recipe or what? Okay, well there are sort of three main blocks to giving a good talk. First, you need to have something fun to talk about. Okay, again, not if you're Simon. He could talk about anything and he would make it just sound super compelling, right? But for the rest of us, we want to think about how to create content. Second is how do you go about the business of designing the talk? And finally, there's how do you deliver the talk itself. Okay, so each of these is a fairly weighty topic. Over the next 20 or so minutes, I'm just going to pick the second one, which is how do you design talks. The other two, one could go on for hours about that. I'm just going to focus on this. How do you design talks? And what, to me, does a good talk look like? So now, whenever you come to this business of how you design X, the first thing you have to answer is, what is it that I want to achieve with my design? What is the goal? What's the specification, if you will? Okay. As I said, as Simon indicated, the goal of a talk is to somehow infect people with an idea, is to spread wisdom. But here's the deal: as you and I know, this notion of a captive audience may have been true in 1984, or maybe 94, or maybe even 2004, but it is certainly not true anymore. Okay? All of you are itching to bust out your phones and play Candy Crush or whatever, right? Check your Twitter feed, who knows what, Facebook, etc., etc. Okay? So to me, the main goal of the talk, or the principal sort of goal of the design, is to somehow figure out how can I get my ideas across without losing you to Candy Crush. And what does it mean without losing you to Candy Crush? I want to make sure that at no point during the 20 minutes or whatever do you get lost. Because the moment you get lost, out comes the phone. Okay? And so really I want to kind of hang on to your attention. I've got it, that's why you came to the room, that's why you're sitting here. I want to make sure that I don't lose it. Okay, so how can I minimize all opportunities for losing you? Okay, so this is going to be the kind of overarching theme. How do I eliminate opportunities for getting lost? And this gentleman, Mickey, who collared me into doing this talk, is Greek, so I thought I'd work in some Greek angle. Okay, so here's the bust of Aristotle, and here's Aristotle's recipe for not losing people. Okay, so he says, tell them what you will tell them, then tell them, then tell them what you just told them. Okay? That's, that sounds cool. Two things. First of all, Aristotle didn't say this. It's a kind of, it's a kind of sort of urban legend. It turns out it was a preacher in 1908. Aristotle said something. It wasn't quite so tweetable. What Aristotle said, you could kind of squint and look at it that way. But anyway, it was this preacher in 1908. More importantly, this advice is roughly the same as those of you, how to draw an owl, draw some circles, draw the rest of the freaking out. Yeah, okay, this is not very helpful. So I'm going to try and break it down a little more. Okay, so here's how I go about designing a talk. The first thing you want to think about is the story. Okay, I'm going to get into this in detail. Okay, so think of it roughly as the outline of the talk. The second thing I think about once I've sort of plotted the overall story is what are the individual scenes? Okay, I'm going to tell you about how I go about designing scenes. And finally, each of the scenes is a kind of sequence of frames. How do I think about every individual frame in a scene? Okay, so let's start at the story, and let's sort of remind ourselves of how we might sort of go about designing a particular story. So what I do, and this is pretty much the same as what Simon said in his talk on how to write papers, right? You want to identify your goal. What is the idea or ideas? What are the things that I want to ram down, as it were? Okay? So you have to start with that. That's where you want to begin. And really, I think of the rest of the talk as kind of gradually, as I think of the rest of the story rather, as articulating a path towards that particular goal. Okay, so you want to start with that goal, and the rest of the story is going to be a path that gets you to that particular goal. Okay? So usually, the thing we want to convey in a technical talk looks roughly like, I have some sort of problem, and here is some solution to that particular problem. Right? This is roughly what the overall goal looks like. And so now, how do I go around designing a path that takes me from the problem to the solution? Well, roughly speaking, what I want to do is, I want to take this long path, which is far too long to think about in one kind of atomic chunk. I want to break it down into a sequence of individual landmarks. Okay, so I want to sort of chop it up into smaller bits, and I'll sort of talk a little bit more about what these landmarks should look like in just a second. So let me give you an example. And the example I'm going to use is this particular talk. Okay? So, what is my goal? My goal was, how do I design talks that, where given a fickle audience, helps them to always enable focus? Right? This was my overall goal. This is the thing I want to convey. Now, how have I broken it down? Well, you can get the idea, right? What are my landmarks? I've sort of broken it down into, first, let me tell you what the notion of the high-level sort of story arc is. Then, break the sort of story, how do I sort of draw each of the scenes out. And finally, how do I show you all the frames? Okay? So now, this is the overall picture of what the story is, right? What's my goal? What are my landmarks? The obvious question is, how do I go about choosing landmarks? Why did I pick these three landmarks and not some other set of three? Now, there's no hard and fast sort of algorithm for this. Instead, what I'm going to tell you is some heuristics to keep in mind about what constitute good landmarks. Okay? So the first one, and this is kind of the most obvious one, is you have to define things before you use them. You can't tell me about, how did Simon say, whiz-wasses if I've never heard of a whiz-was before, right? So specifically, don't put the cart before the horse, okay? If you're going to talk about a solution, you have to first tell me what the problem was. If you're going to tell me about something formal, which by the way, don't. But anyway, you have to give me intuition first, okay? It's pretty much the same thing that Simon said. However, so you want this kind of definition used properly, define things before you use them. But here's the thing that I see I've seen my students commonly make this mistake, where you want to do what I call minimize bandwidth. So what do I mean by minimize bandwidth? So here's one way to think about your talk, sort of progressing over time. Okay, so that's the beginning of the talk, this is the end of the talk. I said define things before you use them, so here's a bunch of definitions, and here's how you might use them, and let's imagine that this definition ends up getting used here, and that one gets used there, and so on and so forth, right? That means that at this particular point during your talk, the members of the audience have to remember 4 different things. I'm confused, I'm lost. Out comes the phone, out comes Candy Crush, okay? And so really what you want to do when you're plotting the landmarks is to see if you can reorder things so that instead, at any one point in time, I can minimize the amount of state that the viewer has. So I just have to remember one thing at a time. Okay, so I'm kind of doing that over here. I'm just telling you about the story now. And then you can forget about the story, we just talk about the scene. And then you can forget about the scene, we just talk about the frames. Okay? So minimize the bandwidth. Okay, excellent. The second thing, and this is again something that Simon alluded to that comes up even when you're writing a paper, and this is a graphical illustration of the slide he had with the fraction of readers who will read your first page, second page, and so on. Is again, as time progresses, this is the fraction of the audience that are paying attention. Okay? And you really want to make sure this is, what was your expression, Simon? Vortex of, what was it? Where is Simon? Vortex of, vortex of.
This stuff at the end, I never see that happen.
You never see it. It needs happen at all. Okay, so you want to start at a high level where everyone's following along. Then, what was it? I made a note of it. I was going to use the expression. You want to gradually draw people into your vortex of X. Damn it, I can't remember what the X was. And neither can Simon apparently. Anyway, you want to gradually introduce technical ideas. Okay. And then finally, as the sort of talk ends, you want to end with, okay, imagine you didn't get any of the technical stuff. Here's a high-level summary and some high-level consequences, even if you skip the middle bits. Okay, you really want to order your landmarks in that way. And finally, I find this to be a very valuable heuristic. Can you use the landmarks as an outline for your talk? For example, here you go. This is what I'm going to be using as an outline for my talk. How to design talks, story, scene, frame. And there's several sort of good reasons for doing this. One is, I'm just going to keep repeating this again and again, right? Because as we sort of go through the talk, you'll see the outline again and again. And it just reinforces the landmarks. Okay, so these are the highest level bits. And it prevents you from getting lost. Remember, that was my overarching goal. I don't want you to get lost. It tells you where you are. It's a way to kind of orient yourself. Okay? Okay, good. So how do you make landmarks? These are 3 little heuristics. And this essentially gives you a way to kind of construct your story by figuring out what the important landmarks are along the way. Next, let's look at a scene. What exactly do I mean by a scene? So once you have this notion of a story, which is a sequence of landmarks, you should think of a scene as essentially describing a short path between landmarks, okay, to get you from one landmark to the next. And here again, I will refer to something that Simon said, use examples. Okay, it's what in the writing business they call show, don't tell, okay? That is to say, use only examples. If you can, do not show me a typing rule, do not show me a theorem, do not, for God's sake, show me pseudocode about an algorithm. In a talk, show me examples of everything, okay? The second thing I'm going to say about a scene is that you should think of a scene not as a collection of slides. In fact, don't think of your talk as a set of slides at all. But think of it as a sequence of transitions that are sort of building on top of each other. Okay, so I'll give you a very concrete example. And really, what this sequence of transitions is doing is gradually building up your landmark, which itself is some kind of example. Okay, so here's my recipe. Every time I want to illustrate something, I first think of a complete example. What is the complete example that illustrates that landmark? Okay? And by complete, there's a sort of, some people have read The Little Prince. You should read The Little Prince if you haven't, it's a great book. There's this very nice quote that I love from The Little Prince. Perfection is achieved not when there is nothing left to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. Because you create your example and then just keep throwing out all the stuff that is not essential to the landmark that you want to illustrate. And what you're left with, that is what I mean by the complete example. Okay, good. So first, identify your complete example. And you start by actually creating the last slide. So this is the final example, say, of the entire Eiffel Tower. And you want to now stare at that example and ask yourself the following questions. Does it show exactly the elements of the landmark that I want it to be shown? Is it as simple as possible, or can I throw more stuff out? And finally, does it look pretty on the screen? Okay, because I need everything to fit on one slide or whatever, right? Second, and this is the weird thing, I work backwards. I do not actually build my talks going forwards. I actually build each scene up backwards. I start with the final complete example, and then I work backwards, just whittling away, starting with, and I sort of come back to nothing. Okay? And now, if you think about it going forwards, I have a sequence of transitions that are building up to my landmark. And each step is showing me some new thing that I want the reader, the viewer, to focus on as I gradually build up to whatever my example was. Okay? And so, this is what I'm going to say about a scene. It's a sequence of transitions that illustrates a particular landmark. And now here's the weird thing. I remember I said, when I started this is not if you're Simon Peyton-Jones, right? Who could give him that talk without any slides and with a brown paper bag over his head. And it would make fantastic sense. When you draw your scenes, you should just try to play it without any speech and see if they're comprehensible. Okay, and I call this the monkey test. Your talk, really, the scene should make sense without any speech at all. Okay, so here's an example. Talking about examples, so let's look at this. So a couple of months ago, I had to give a talk where it doesn't matter what the whole talk was about, but one of the landmarks I wanted to illustrate was the data structure called an interval set. Okay, so that was the landmark that I wanted to illustrate, and these are, in fact, from my notes from making that talk, right? I didn't make it for this talk, I had it for that one. So then I started with the complete example, so I sort of drew it out on a piece of paper. This is what the final slide should look like. Represent a set of integers, something, order them into a list, partition into a complete something. Then I worked backwards at the sequence of transitions. I was like, okay, I want to build up to this, I'm going to whittle the bottom line away, I should get something like that, whittle it away, get something like that. And finally, this is the actual sequence, the actual set of slides, right? So this is the kind of the keynote rendering of my hand notes. Data structure represents sets, it's a set of numbers, and then I order them into a sequence, and then I partition them into intervals. Okay, so this is how I sort of build up. I start backwards, and I end up with this particular thing. Oh, I should say, no, it's up to you to decide, of course. Does this scene make sense without any audio? I think it does, but I was talking, so you can't really decide that now. But you can look at it offline. Okay, excellent. Finally, let's talk about frames, and let me see where I am on time. 2:58. What am I on time? 10 minutes? Okay, that's perfect. So now you can imagine, what is a frame? A frame is essentially the thing that is on the screen at a particular instant in time. Okay? So what is on a single slide? And this is perhaps my most kind of extreme opinion, which is that there needs to be one thing to focus on the slide. On any given moment, there should be just one thing that everyone is supposed to be looking at. And not two things, not three things, because again, the moment there's three things, like, what am I supposed to look at? How comes the four? Okay? So now, how do I ensure that there's exactly one thing, and that thing is obvious? There should be no guessing involved. Okay, so here's a couple of strategies. One is, be minimal. If there's two words on the screen, what else are you going to look at? Okay? A blank space, I don't know, the pixels, there's just two things to look at, right? So that's one way, make the focus just completely obvious. Now there's I'll have a link at the end. There's a guy called Jonathan Schuchuk who has a nice webpage on how to make talks. And he describes this as the 12 words per slide rule. You should have no more than 12 words per slide. It's kind of extreme, but it makes sense. How many words is that? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, that's good. Oh crap, and there's more. And it's in small fonts. You're not supposed to do that. Okay, specifically, yeah. Don't ever make slides like this. Yeah, don't. And never have 3 nested bullets. It's just like, don't do that. Specifically, and here's a particularly weird quirk. I'm going to really, this is something that really, really bothers me. This is green pen, okay? Never have text that wraps around, okay? There's nothing that destroys more focus more quickly than having to wrap. I don't know what it is. I'm not like an eye doctor or whatever, right? But there's something about having to do this kind of carriage return with your optical nerves that just somehow throws me, right? So you can just make sure that you can always make, sentences just end without having to wrap around. Okay, good. Sometimes you need more than 2 words on a slide, come on, okay? And so in this case, what you want to do is essentially what I said, you work backwards from the end and be incremental, right? So the idea here is gradually build up to the landmark, and at each point, the focus, the thing that the reader, the viewer is supposed to be looking at is the diff. Okay, so that's where you're supposed to be looking. And I already showed you this, so we'll be very quick. Right now, you're obviously supposed to look at this, and there was a little transition, you're supposed to look at that particular music, right? Finally, sometimes you just have to have a bunch of stuff. You've tried your best. There's no way you can squish everything down and so on and so forth. And so the third strategy is to essentially highlight the focus. Tell me what I'm supposed to be looking at. How many people here know what this is? Here's Waldo. This is like a children's book. There's this funny little guy. Apparently he's called Wally in the United Kingdom and Waldo in the US. And you have these sort of little, children's books where there's pictures that look like this. Somewhere here is Waldo. Imagine this was your slide. Where is Waldo? Okay. Well, here's Waldo. He's right there. And that's what I mean by highlighting the focus. Now, obviously, if you're giving a technical talk, you're not going to be looking for Waldo. Instead, it might look something like this. So let me go back to my running example. The very next slide that was my data structure, this list 1 through 5, 7 through 8, 9 to 30. And here what I want to do is I want to focus on that's the tail, and I want you to look over here, right? And so I'm telling you where to look. That's really what I mean by highlight the focus. Where am I? 3:02. 5 more minutes?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. Oh, more than 5. Okay, cool. So, when you're designing the frame, you need to ensure that there is exactly one thing that people are supposed to be paying attention to, and make that thing very obvious. Okay, there should be no guesswork. So, be as minimal as you can. If you must have more than one thing, focus on gradually layering things in. And finally, you really, really have to have a lot of stuff on your slide, then highlight that focus. But that's pretty much it. This is my highest level sort of recipe for designing talks. Start by figuring out your high level story, which is going to be identified by figuring out the landmarks that lead to whatever goal, whatever virus it is that you want to spread. Next, you think of the scenes, which are essentially illustrating each of these landmarks gradually by a sequence of transitions. Making sure, as you sort of build this scene, that in each frame, it's completely obvious what the person should be looking at, what each person should be looking at. Now, I should point out, it should be pretty obvious once you make a talk, you'll see that there's a kind of circular dependency in all of this, right? Well, when I'm designing the frames, depending on what scenes I have, maybe there's too much stuff. So maybe I need to break up my landmarks. I need to have smaller landmarks or simpler landmarks, and so on and so forth, right? So you may have to reorder landmarks. Another thing I find that's common is it's only after you design the scenes that you realize, oh wait, this thing actually depends on that other thing, and so I need to reorder things in order to minimize the bandwidth, as it were. Yeah.
So could you go back a slide, because there was too much on the slide and I couldn't fit it all in my head.
Well done, well played, sir. Okay, but I won't. Because David will get very angry. And so anyway, moving on. Let me just say one last thing, which is, I said I wouldn't talk about these other things, but let me just say, I mean, it's great. You already saw Simon in action, so you've gotten a very good sense of how it is, how to focus on this business of delivering the talks. There's a computer scientist called James Mickens, whose work some of you may or may not be familiar with. And Mickens gives fantastic talks and he writes really well. And this is what Mickens says. Somebody asked him, hey, how do you give such good talks? And he says, well, you spend 3 months preparing. And this is the important bit, study videos of other inspiring speakers. Okay? And by inspiring speakers, I don't just mean folks like Simon and Stephanie, but also sort of beyond computer science, right? So the 3 specific categories, I would say, are preachers, not just the gentleman who came up with the tell me, tell me, tell me, but just like, you should just see, Martin Luther King give speeches, for example. It's something to behold. Politicians, because, they really, I mean, the good politicians. And finally, this may not be completely obvious, comedians, okay? So you should just like look at Chris Rock, for example, or pick your favorite comedian. It's amazing to see what they do. Okay, well that's pretty much it. That's all I'm going to say. I'm very happy that I ended on time. Thank you very much.
There's plenty of time for
Oh my God, dude.
5 minutes.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah. Yes, questions. I'm happy to take questions. No questions.
Are these slides?
Oh, more questions. Sorry. Sorry, there was a hand there. Oh, yeah.
How do you give a bad talk? What are some questions that you think are really
I'm
terrible?
incapable of answering that question. I should say something, by the way, since you asked me, I had done with bad talks. One of the most important parts of giving talks is the answering of questions. And my one bit of advice for that, especially is, for those of you who are going to go to grad school, there's really one way to learn how to answer questions, which is to TA. You should just TA as much as you can. You should think of TAing as a, what is the expression, feature and not a bug. Because that's your, that's an opportunity where you're, routinely standing in front of people answering questions. Because a very common mistake that people make, that students make when they come to ICFP or whatever and give a talk, is they finish their talk and say Simon or Phil or somebody asks them a question, and the question might be quite a, it's probably quite a simple question that they can answer quite easily, but because they feel so intimidated by the setting, they somehow think Simon has uncovered some deep bug in their system, and their whole world is coming crashing down. That's really not the case. Simon really meant, no, shouldn't there be 2 semicolons on slide 7, right? It's often something like that. And really, the only way to overcome this is by lecturing a lot and TAing and so on and so forth. So that's one way, again, sorry to not give a bad talk. There was another question somewhere? Yeah.
Do you find, focusing on this talk for technical talks, do you find it useful to put title and maybe section or sort of environment for the slides?
I do. I mean, just right. Again, it's by way of orienting what part of the proceedings you're in. But again, you want to make sure that you put some of that information for context, but not too much. Because again, if you put in too much, then what am I focusing on? Right? So you're absolutely right.
Can I make a comment on that?
Yeah.
So the thing to not do is to start off with a content slide and spend 5 minutes talking through it. You're just burning cycles of time at that high audience attention moment. But later on in the talk, as a way to say I'm now transitioning from one landmark to another, putting up a little content saying I've got this file and I'm going there briefly is great.
But I think she was asking about a footer. We're talking about a footer on every slide.
Food as well.
Slide
Anyways, because I noticed that in these talks about giving good talks, you never use those titles. Maybe.
But it can have titles. Are you kidding me? I didn't even notice. See how to deliver talks. Let's pick a slide at random. Highlight the focus. Be incremental. Be minimal, etc., etc. So, but I think both of you are right. I think what Simon says is you need to have those the outline, and then you want to tell people when you're transitioning, as it were.
Don't start with a long bit about it.
Exactly. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them what you're going to. Right. Sorry, Ryan.
Well, yeah, I just think that the aesthetics can sometimes maybe bump up against the practical concerns. Like, it's aesthetically pleasing to not have slide numbers, but I haven't seen any argument that they're not actually useful. Because when someone wants to ask you a question, it's a lot nicer if they can ask about slide 35 than, hey, back up, no, over there, no, over there.
Right.
But never slide 35 out of 104.
But Ranjit sidesteps that because he just says no when you ask him to.
Overrated.
How do you read an audience?
How do you read an audience?
Yeah, so I think an important part of learning to give a good talk might be actually learning when you're doing things wrong.
So, I mean, right, that's a very good point. And the answer is, of course, quite different depending on whether you're lecturing in a class versus giving a talk, say, at ICFP. Because when you're giving a talk at ICFP, you can't really constantly probe the audience. But when you're in class, you can. You can constantly keep asking questions. So I don't really have a particularly good answer. I mean, you have to kind of look at, I guess one way is just coarse-grained statistics. How many people are looking at their phones right now? That kind of thing. How many people are looking at me versus looking at their phone? But that's not a lot of information. For example, I've been teaching for 15 years, and it's only recently I started using these clicker things, for example, and it's been, it's transformative. It's really a big transformation, because before that, I think I know what people are getting stuck on, but now with the clicker stuff, I can ask them and I can get feedback on. I'm like, wow, is that what you're stuck on? You see, so yeah, you can get a lot more information by asking questions. So, very ironic to me. Yes, go on.
Two or three things.
A two-part question.
First of all, can we download these somewhere?
Yes, I will make it available very soon. Thank you.
And what do you think about laser pointers?
What do I think about laser pointers?
Well, I mean, in the context of talks.
Oh, I mean, it's fun. What do you think about the Star Wars program? The Space Force. Let's see, I mean, I like them. I have nothing against them. But, I mean, as I said, I used to use them a lot, but then I've sort of gotten to this point where ideally you shouldn't, this is like the Steve Jobs kind of thing, right? If they have to use a stylus, you've lost already. Of course, he was totally wrong about that, right? But where you shouldn't really need them because it ought to be clear what their point, but sometimes you do, and I do use them for that reason. Yeah.
But the usual advice on that is relates to talk delivery. You don't want to look away from your audience to the screen. That using laser pointer is bad for that reason.
Oh, I see. Fair enough. I'm not.
And you should just highlight it using the tiny highlights.
I will say this, much as so absolutely right. So you should be looking at the audience, not the screen or your laptop for that matter. And for that reason, these gadgets, the ones that you push the button and it moves to the next slide, just must buy them. There's just like, whenever you see, I don't know what it is, I'm not a psychologist, but whenever you see somebody kind of standing over their laptop and having to hit the next button, there's somehow it constrains them. It doesn't, I don't know what it is, but it doesn't kind of open you up to speak clearly. Yes?
So, turning to the question of understanding the audience, I find this really difficult to do when you don't have a lot of practice. Like, how much did you need to prep for a talk like this versus maybe something ICFP? Like, do you just know these people already? How did you get to the point to understand what they enjoyed seeing?
All that advice about you should go and teach so that you can answer questions, I don't know how to answer that question. I have to take it offline. Maybe Simon has an answer of it. So how much did I prepare? How do I know what you're going to want to see?
I mean, if you read books on how to prepare a talk, one common thread is understand the audience, and that's something I haven't heard touched on yet.
That's a very good point. So I guess this is perhaps, I will cheat and say part of the delivery where and what you ought to be doing when you prepare talks is you must practice them on people, on your colleagues, wherever you work, other graduate students, your advisor, and so on and so forth. And that turns out to be a very, very good way of shaking out those particular parts, as it were, right? Because you will get this, again, I think as Simon mentioned when he was talking about writing papers, when you give it to your colleagues, they say, I got lost on line 3, on page 3, things like that. The same thing happens with the talk, right? There are these implicit dependencies that you have not realized that show up only really when you show it to other people, right? So I don't have any answer beyond make sure you have at least some practices with other people.
You can make it interactive too. So a big set piece conference talk is one thing, that's unidirectional. But anything in a room like this or in the department, you can turn it into a conversation.
Right.
So a bad sign is if people are reading their phones are just not interacting with you. It's really good if you can get people to ask questions. I sometimes just stop altogether and say, I'm not going to go on until somebody asks a question. And then, then the floodgates can be only one person has to ask, and then you get into a dialogue. And then it becomes a conversation. And you may not finish your talk, but that's good.
Or dually, only one person has to be shut down, and there will be no more questions. That was a joke, by the way.
All right.
Okay, sorry, David. Yes.